Chapter 14. A Prophecy Divides. The atmosphere within the council chamber grew heavier with every passing moment. The once brilliant walls that had shimmered with the light of the sea now felt suffocating, casting long shadows that seemed to close in around the seated figures. It was as though the very space itself had become a reflection of the rift that had split the council down the middle. The air hummed with the collective tension, a mix of disbelief, fear, and simmering anger that hung thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. The council, once a unified front, now seemed to be at the brink of fracture. The discord between the members was palpable, with some brimming with cautious hope, and others seething with distrust and fear of the prophecy. The cracks in their unity were widening, and there was no mistaking the deep divide that had formed. Seb stood beside Alaric, his muscles coiled tight, feeling every pair of eyes in the chamber upon him. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the council members, each of them a study in conflicting emotions. The murmurs of dissent and reluctant agreement echoed in the vast stone chamber, reverberating off the walls and mixing into an overwhelming cacophony. This was uncharted territory for the Sirens. The prophecy had resurfaced like a forgotten weapon, and it had ignited a storm of emotions none of them had been prepared for. Seb could feel the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on him. Some of the council saw the prophecy as a flicker of hope, a possibility for reconciliation with the human world, a chance to end centuries of animosity. Others, however, saw it as an omen, a grim warning that would lead them down a path of destruction. Alaric's gaze flicked briefly to Seb, his expression unreadable. But Seb could feel the weight of something unspoken between them, something that both bound them together and set them apart. Despite the fiery arguments erupting around them, there was a quiet understanding that seemed to pass between them. Seb had struggled with his own doubts about the prophecy, about whether Alaric's faith in it, and in him, was misplaced. But now, as the council bickered and argued, those doubts seemed insignificant in the face of what was happening. He was standing at the edge of something far larger than either of them, and it was clear that the outcome of this meeting would determine the course of their worlds. There was no room for hesitation now. "I don't trust it," growled the broad-shouldered Siren, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. His deep emerald scales seemed to shimmer darkly in the dim light, reflecting the brewing storm of emotion in the chamber. The anger in his voice was unmistakable as he spoke, the distrust and disdain for the human world thick in his words. "A union between human and siren? Ridiculous. We've fought their kind for centuries, bled for our survival. Do we honestly believe that one human can change that? This prophecy, whatever it claims to be, is a trap. It's nothing but a lure to lead us to our graves." His words hung in the air like a challenge, defiant and unyielding. The room grew even colder with the growing murmurs of agreement from the other council members. It was clear that the Siren's words had struck a chord, and the tension in the chamber thickened with every passing second. Seb could feel the weight of the hostility in the room, the sharp glances that were cast in his direction. It was clear that for many of them, he was still nothing more than an outsider, an enemy who didn't belong in this space. His presence was a symbol of everything they had fought against for centuries. His heart pounded in his chest, and his throat felt tight with the knowledge that the path ahead was fraught with danger, not just for him, but for Alaric and the future of both their peoples. The elder Siren, who had once defended them, remained silent, his expression unreadable. His golden scales glinted faintly in the low light, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling around him. The deep-set lines on his face grew more pronounced as he watched the exchange unfold. He had yet to speak, and his silence felt heavier than any words could convey. It was as if he were weighing the future in his mind, struggling to find a way forward that would not destroy everything they had fought to protect. His posture remained regal, but there was an undeniable air of unease that hung about him, the burden of leadership pressing down on his shoulders. Seb stole another glance at Alaric, sensing the tension in his movements. Despite the anger that was mounting around them, Alaric remained composed, his resolve unwavering. Seb admired that about him, the way he could stand tall in the face of opposition, even when the weight of the situation seemed to threaten to crush him. But Seb could also sense the uncertainty that lingered beneath the surface. Alaric's belief in the prophecy, in him, had been tested, and now they were standing on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. Seb couldn't help but wonder if this was really the only way forward, or if they were being drawn into a trap far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. The murmurs in the chamber grew louder, as though the room itself was vibrating with the force of conflicting ideologies. The Sirens had never faced such a dilemma before, and it was clear that their ancient traditions and beliefs were being tested in ways they had never anticipated. The fate of their world was at stake, and yet, despite the uncertainty, there were those who were willing to listen, to give this human, this pirate, a chance. But others, those who had lived through the pain of centuries of war, could not let go of their distrust so easily. The gulf between them was vast, and the consequences of this meeting would ripple through the fabric of their world for generations to come. Seb felt the weight of the council's gaze on him, their judgment heavy and unyielding. But despite the fear that gripped him, there was also a spark of determination, of hope. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Alaric. It was about something much bigger than either of them. And as the heated arguments continued to swirl around him, Seb knew one thing for certain: whatever the outcome, they could not afford to back down now. The prophecy, for better or worse, had chosen them. And if they were to survive, they would have to find a way to unite, no matter the cost. We have lived through war, betrayal, and slaughter at the hands of humankind. The elder spoke slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of history. His words carried the gravitas of countless generations, the wisdom of ages etched in every syllable. He paused, his eyes lingering on the faces of his fellow council members before turning his gaze toward Alaric and Seb. And we've learned from those wounds. I, too, am hesitant to place our faith in a prophecy that has not been seen in centuries. Yet, there is something that stirs in me, a sense that this is not something we can simply dismiss. His voice grew softer, but the significance of his words hung in the air, thick and laden with meaning. Perhaps it is not only the human world that has suffered under the weight of these cycles of war. Perhaps we, too, have lost something in the process. Could this union be our salvation? Or our undoing? The silence that followed was deafening, stretching long enough for every member of the council to feel its weight. It was as though the very air in the room had become thick with anticipation, as though the ocean itself had paused in its endless movement to hear the outcome of this debate. The elder's words had planted a seed of doubt, and the council members exchanged glances, some thoughtful, others skeptical. Seb could feel the tension tightening around him, the uncertainty thick enough to almost be tasted. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Alaric, who was watching the elder with an expression of quiet respect, but underneath, there was a flicker of hope. Then, a voice cut through the silence, a soft, melodic whisper that held an undercurrent of cold, sharp resolve. The speaker was a siren who had remained silent thus far, her presence quiet but imposing. She stepped forward, her raven-black scales absorbing the dim light, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like tendrils. When she spoke, there was no hesitation, no trace of uncertainty in her tone. If it is salvation, it is one I do not wish to see. Her words were laced with venom, the kind that could chill the very soul. If we are to entertain this prophecy, we do so at our own peril. The human world has shown us nothing but greed, violence, and betrayal. We are not meant to ally with them. We are not meant to share our power with them. To do so would be to invite our extinction." Her words landed with a heavy thud, and the council members stirred. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, some voices rising in agreement, others tightening in apprehension. Several of the sirens nodded, their expressions hardening, their eyes narrowed with distrust. Seb could feel the full weight of their hatred, their ancient grievances brought to the surface with this woman's venomous words. It was as though every ounce of hostility they had ever felt toward humans, toward him, had coalesced into a single, sharp-edged declaration. He felt as though he were trapped in a vice, the pressure of their collective disdain pressing against his chest, suffocating him. For a moment, it seemed as though the council was on the verge of erupting into chaos, the tension teetering on the edge of violence. But then, Alaric spoke, his voice cutting through the rising tide of anger like a steady hand holding back a storm. He stood tall, his posture unyielding, his eyes locked on the council members. His words were calm, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that trembled just beneath the surface. "And yet, if we do nothing, if we continue down this path of war and hatred, where does it lead us? More death? More destruction?" His voice carried the weight of all the losses they had endured, the endless cycle of bloodshed that had ravaged their world for centuries. This prophecy could be our only chance to break the cycle, to find something more than endless bloodshed. Alaric's gaze swept the room, his eyes searching the faces of the council members, urging them to consider what was truly at stake. "I do not believe in destiny alone, but I do believe in our ability to shape the future," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "And perhaps this is the only way forward." His words hung in the air, offering both a plea and a challenge. Seb felt a surge of gratitude for Alaric, for the quiet strength he exuded in this moment of crisis. It was clear that Alaric was not just fighting for his own belief in the prophecy, but for the survival of both their peoples. The elder siren's gaze shifted between Alaric and the siren who had spoken out against the prophecy. His eyes, once hard with the wisdom of ages, now reflected the weight of a decision that would affect the very future of their world. His golden scales shimmered faintly as he took a step back, his posture contemplative. The silence in the room deepened once more, and it was as though time itself had come to a halt, waiting for the elder's response. The council members, too, seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the elder's decision. Seb's heart raced, every second stretching out as if the very fabric of reality had become a taut wire, waiting to snap. Seb found himself torn, caught between the two opposing forces in the room. On one hand, he understood the siren's fears, the centuries of bloodshed, the pain that had been passed down through generations. But on the other, Alaric's words resonated deeply within him. Could this prophecy truly be their chance to break free from the endless cycles of war and mistrust? Or would it be the beginning of their final destruction? The weight of this decision was more than just a political maneuver. It was the fate of both their peoples, and perhaps even the fate of the world itself, hanging in the balance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the elder spoke, his voice low and measured. "We stand at a crossroads, and the path we choose will define the future of our kind." His eyes flicked to Seb, then back to Alaric. "You have spoken of hope, Alaric. But remember this, hope is a fragile thing. It can either light our way or lead us into darkness. We will entertain this prophecy, but it will not be without tests. You will prove your worth, and the human who stands with you will prove his own." The room held its breath, and Seb knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning of a far more dangerous journey. The council erupted into chaos once again, the room filled with clashing voices and sharp words. Each siren spoke with a sense of urgency, as if their very survival depended on the outcome of the debate. Some voices rose in protest, echoing distrust and caution, while others, more reluctant, seemed to edge closer to agreeing with Alaric's vision. The room became a battlefield, each speaker vying for dominance, each argument a weapon in an invisible war. Seb could feel the pressure building around him, the tension thick in the air. It wasn't just the weight of the words being spoken that pressed upon him. It was the sheer magnitude of what was at stake. These were the people who had lived beneath the waves for centuries, isolated from the humans they had come to distrust so thoroughly. They had endured countless wars, survived betrayals, and had seen horrors beyond measure. Could they truly change their ways? Could the union Alaric spoke of be the key to healing a wound that had festered for so long? Through the cacophony, the voice of the elder siren cut through like a crashing wave, his words slow and deliberate, heavy with years of experience and wisdom. "I see your point, Alaric," he began, his tone thoughtful but wary. "But we cannot ignore the consequences of our actions. We cannot simply place our faith in this human, in this prophecy, and expect peace to follow. There are too many unknowns, too many dangers." His gaze flicked to the others in the room, as if silently urging them to understand the weight of what he was saying. The elder's words were a stark reminder of the risks involved, the possibility that this fragile hope could shatter, that it could lead them into yet another cycle of pain and loss. Alaric, however, did not falter. His eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and desperation, the fire of his conviction burning bright. "I understand the risks," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But can we afford to do nothing? Can we sit idly by while both our worlds crumble under the weight of hatred and fear? If we do nothing, the prophecy will come to pass regardless, and it will be our failure, our doom." The room fell silent at his words, the raw truth of them hanging in the air. It was a declaration not just of the stakes at hand, but of the unbearable weight of inaction. For a moment, Seb could see the flicker of fear in the eyes of the council members, as though they, too, understood that doing nothing might lead them down an even darker path. The silence that followed stretched out, thick and heavy. Each member of the council was lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the decision before them. Seb stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Alaric as he spoke, as though trying to piece together the fragmented images of a future that seemed both impossibly distant and dangerously close. The chamber was quiet now, save for the sound of soft breathing and the occasional murmur from one of the council members. Seb's mind raced, torn between the weight of the decision and the uncertainty of what the future might hold. Could Alaric's words truly lead them to a new beginning, or were they simply a desperate plea for change that might only bring more suffering? Finally, the elder siren spoke again, his voice softer now, yet unyielding in its resolve. "We will not reach a decision today," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the room, meeting the eyes of each council member. His words were final, a clear signal that the debate was far from over. "There is too much at stake. This council will reconvene in 3 days, and we will discuss the matter further. We will not be swayed by fear alone, nor by hope. We must consider the fate of all our people, both human and siren." The elder's tone was one of careful deliberation, as though he understood the weight of the decision they faced, and was unwilling to rush into it without further reflection. Seb could feel the tension lift slightly at the elder's words, though it was replaced with a sense of foreboding. 3 days. That was all they had, 3 days to convince the council, to make them see reason, to somehow bridge the divide between two worlds that had been at odds for centuries. It was a small window of time, but it was all they had. And in that time, Seb knew, everything would be on the line. He glanced at Alaric, seeing the determination in his eyes, and wondered how they would navigate the coming days. What would it take to sway the council's decision? And if they failed, what would become of them? As the council members slowly began to disperse, some still exchanging quiet words, Seb felt a growing sense of unease. The elders' words had been measured, but the decision was far from certain. The next 3 days would be critical, and he could feel the weight of the coming days pressing down on him like a heavy tide. He knew that no matter what happened, the world was shifting, and they would be swept along with it, whether they were ready or not. Turning to Alaric, Seb saw the quiet resolve in his expression, the same determination that had been there from the very beginning. Alaric was committed to this cause, and Seb couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for him. In the midst of all the uncertainty, Alaric was unwavering, a beacon in the storm. But Seb also felt a pang of doubt. 3 days. Could they truly change the hearts of these ancient beings? Would they be able to convince them that peace, however fragile, was worth pursuing? Or would they, like so many before them, be swallowed by the tide of their own fears and distrust? The answers, Seb knew, were yet to come. And in the meantime, they would have to prepare for whatever the future held. The room hummed with a low, uneasy energy as the council members began to rise from their seats, the soft rustling of robes and the shuffle of movement filling the air. Some sirens stood in agreement, their expressions hard but resolute, while others voiced their protest more loudly, their voices sharp and filled with distrust. Yet, despite the outward expressions of unity or division, none of them seemed truly settled in their minds. The weight of the decision before them hung heavy in the air, the council still deeply divided. Seb's heart beat faster as he realized just how fragile their situation was. The debate was far from over, and the fate of their alliance, of the prophecy itself, was anything but decided. They had only just begun the battle, and already, Seb could sense the storm that was building. Alaric's posture was visibly weary as he stood, the lines on his face deepening with the burden of the argument. It was clear that the fight had drained him, his usual fire now tempered by exhaustion and uncertainty. Seb could see the weight of the council's judgment pressing down on him, the long hours of debate and opposition taking their toll. Alaric's shoulders slumped slightly, a subtle but telling sign that the fight had been more than just a clash of words. It had been a battle for the future itself. Seb stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Alaric's tired face, knowing that the next few days would demand everything they had. The stakes were too high to be deterred now. His voice was low, but it carried a sense of unwavering determination. "We have 3 days," Seb said, his tone firm, but not without compassion. "That's more than I thought we'd get. But we can't stop now. We need to make them see reason. We need to prove that we are more than just enemies." The words were meant to rally Alaric, to remind him that despite the overwhelming odds, they still had a chance. It wasn't much, but it was a chance, something that had seemed impossible only moments before. The 3-day reprieve was a small victory in itself, but Seb knew it wouldn't be enough. They had to push harder, dig deeper, and do whatever it took to break the barriers of fear and distrust. Alaric met his gaze, his eyes softening as Seb spoke. There was a quiet understanding in them, a recognition that the fight was far from over. The lines on his face spoke of exhaustion, but there was also something else, a deeper resolve. "I know, Seb," Alaric replied, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "But sometimes, even when the truth is in front of us, the hardest part is convincing others to see it." The words held a weight of experience, of battles fought both in the world and within his own heart. Alaric had always been someone who believed in the power of truth, but the council's skepticism was a barrier unlike any other they had faced. As they turned to leave the council chamber, Seb couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The future of their world, of their people, hung in the balance. It wasn't just the prophecy they had to contend with. It was the centuries of animosity, distrust, and bloodshed that had defined the relationship between humans and sirens. The prophecy had become a catalyst, a symbol of change, but it was also a flashpoint for everything that had been left unresolved. Seb felt a surge of resolve, a fire burning in him that pushed aside the lingering doubt. But that resolve was tempered by the knowledge that they were treading on dangerous ground. The future was uncertain, and every step they took was a gamble. Seb's thoughts flickered to the bond he shared with Alaric. It was undeniable, this connection between them, a bond forged in the fires of conflict and slowly nurtured through understanding. But now, more than ever, their bond felt fragile, as if it could either become the key to unlocking a new future or the very thing that could tear them apart. He could feel the weight of that uncertainty pressing on his chest, but there was no room for hesitation. The world was at stake, and they had to act as though the outcome depended entirely on them, even if that was a crushing responsibility to bear. Alaric seemed to sense his thoughts, his gaze lingering on Seb for a moment longer than usual. There was something unspoken in the way they looked at each other, something that transcended words. Seb knew that Alaric understood just how much was on the line, not just for their world, but for them as well. But there was no time for sentimentality now. They had a plan, a fragile hope that needed to be nurtured, and they couldn't afford to falter. As they stepped out of the council chamber and into the quiet corridor beyond, Seb's thoughts raced with everything they had to accomplish in the coming days. The prophecy, the alliance, the trust between human and siren, it all felt so precarious, like a delicate thread that could snap with the slightest misstep. But as Seb looked at Alaric once more, he saw the same determination that had first drawn him to the pirate captain. Whatever happened in the next 3 days, Seb knew one thing for certain: they couldn't give up. Not now. Not when the possibility of something greater than endless war was so close within their grasp. They had 3 days, and that would have to be enough. Chapter 15: The Pirate's Dilemma. Seb sat alone on the edge of the rocky outcrop, his posture rigid as he stared out over the crashing waves below. The ocean, once a symbol of his freedom, now felt like an alien force, vast, indifferent, and unyielding. The salty spray from the waves whipped against his skin, stinging his raw, exposed face. The wind tugged at his tattered coat, its cold fingers seeping into his bones, adding to the weight of the turmoil that churned within him. It was as though the very element he had once ruled over had turned against him, mocking him with its relentless power and distance. The sea had been his home, his sanctuary, the place where he could forget the world and its troubles. But now, with the prophecy looming and the weight of a future that was no longer his to control, the ocean felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. His crew had been more than just a group of men to him. They had been his family, his brothers in arms. Each member had played a role in the tapestry of his life, sharing in both the triumphs and the hardships of their pirate existence. Together, they had faced down enemies, braved treacherous waters, and built a reputation that stretched across both the human and siren worlds. But now, that world was gone. The siren's song, the ship that had carried them through countless battles and storms, was no more. The wreckage of the ship lay at the bottom of the ocean, and with it, the camaraderie and trust that had bound them together. The loss of his crew was more than just the end of a chapter. It was the erasure of everything he had known, a deep wound that the sea, for all its familiarity, could no longer heal. Seb's fingers tangled in his windswept hair, his thoughts a chaotic mess of uncertainty. The prophecy, the one that had brought him to this place, hovered over him like a shadow, both a glimmer of hope and a harbinger of doom. The idea of a union between human and siren seemed impossible, a reckless idea born from desperation. On one hand, it represented an opportunity, a chance to end the centuries of bloodshed and distrust between their worlds, to bring about a change that could reshape the future. It was a chance to do something greater than himself, to be part of a cause that could have far-reaching consequences. But on the other hand, the implications terrified him. A pirate and a siren, two sworn enemies forced into a union by fate. Could such an alliance truly bring peace, or would it only hasten their destruction? The uncertainty of it all gnawed at him, a question with no clear answer. The image of Alaric flashed in his mind, unbidden but undeniable. Seb's heart tightened at the thought of the siren, the man who had become something far more significant than just an enemy. Alaric had gone from a mysterious figure in his life to a companion, a partner in this strange, tumultuous journey. There was a growing connection between them, a bond that neither of them had expected, yet neither could deny. It was a relationship born out of necessity at first. Alaric had saved Seb's life, and Seb had found himself drawn into Alaric's world. But now, with each passing day, that connection had deepened, and Seb found himself feeling something more, a pull, something dangerous and uncharted, that threatened to unravel him. What began as a simple alliance was evolving into something more complicated, something that made his heart race in ways he hadn't expected. Seb leaned forward, elbows resting heavily on his knees as he buried his face in his hands. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and for a moment, he allowed himself the luxury of weakness. He had never been one to shy away from difficult decisions. Pirates didn't survive long without a certain ruthlessness, a certain ability to detach from their emotions. But this was different. Alaric wasn't just another enemy to be outsmarted, another challenge to be overcome. No, Alaric was something far more complex. He was Seb's savior, his equal in ways Seb hadn't known were possible. And now, Seb could feel his heart slowly being drawn into the depths of something he wasn't sure he could navigate, something that threatened to drown him in its unknowns. The reality of his situation settled on him like a heavy cloak. He had never been the type to entertain grand notions of fate or destiny, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. He had always prided himself on his ability to chart his own course, to remain the master of his fate, unbound by forces beyond his control. But with Alaric, things were different. The bond they shared was not something he could control, nor could he deny it. It was as if the currents of fate had conspired to bring them together, despite the chasm of hatred and distrust that had existed between their people for centuries. What he felt for Alaric wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something more profound, and that scared him more than anything. He let out a shaky breath, lifting his head to look out at the vast, dark expanse of the ocean before him. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, the sound a constant reminder of the chaos swirling in his heart. The sea had always been a place of comfort, a force he could control. But now, it felt more like a reflection of the storm raging within him. Alaric was the one person who understood him in ways no one else ever had, but their bond was complicated by the prophecy, by the forces of fate, and by the very nature of their people's enmity. What did it mean for a pirate and a siren to share the same cause? Could they truly find a way to coexist, to work together toward a future that didn't end in tragedy? The cold wind whipped around him, tugging at his coat as he stood and took a few steps closer to the edge of the outcrop, gazing out at the horizon. His heart ached with the weight of what lay ahead. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate treacherous waters, both literal and metaphorical, but this felt different. The ocean, for all its vastness and mystery, had never seemed so uncertain. The prophecy, the union with Alaric, the future of both their worlds, all of it was caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: he couldn't keep running from it. Not when the stakes were this high, not when he had so much to lose. Seb turned away from the sea, his resolve hardening despite the uncertainty. The choices before him were as vast and unpredictable as the ocean, But one thing was certain: he couldn't walk away from this. Whatever the future held, he would face it head on. And in doing so, he knew he would either rise above the waves or be swallowed by them. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the familiar scent of the sea, salt and brine, mingled with something else, something faint, a melody almost, like the echo of a song that had long been forgotten. Seb looked up sharply, startled by the change in the air, his senses alert. His gaze immediately fell on Alaric, who stood a few paces away. The siren's figure was silhouetted against the setting sun, his form lit up in hues of gold and red. His silvery hair flowed around him like a river of light, reflecting the fading rays of the sun, almost ethereal in its beauty. The sight of him, framed by the vastness of the ocean and the waning light, took Seb's breath away for a moment. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, everything else disappeared. The crashing waves, the vast expanse of the sky, it all faded away, leaving only the two of them, standing on the edge of a world that seemed to be waiting for something to shift. "You've been quiet." Alaric's voice cut through the silence, soft but edged with concern. The sound of it wrapped around Seb, drawing him back to reality. "Is everything all right?" Alaric's words were laced with more than just casual inquiry. There was an undercurrent of something deeper, a concern that reached beyond the surface. Seb could hear it in the way the siren spoke, the subtle tension that had been building between them ever since the prophecy had been revealed. Despite the weight of the world that lay on their shoulders, Alaric still seemed to care, and for a fleeting moment Seb felt something stir within him, a warmth that he hadn't expected. Seb hesitated, his mind swirling with confusion and doubt. He had been avoiding this moment for days now, ever since the prophecy had been revealed, since the council had decided to give the Union a chance. The tension between them had been palpable, and Seb knew that the path ahead of them was uncertain, both for their worlds and for whatever relationship they were building. But even with all the challenges that lay ahead, the emotions that had been bubbling beneath the surface could no longer be ignored. He had tried to bury them, to focus on the mission, to forge an alliance between their worlds for the sake of the future. But every time he looked at Alaric, it was like the weight of his feelings grew heavier, dragging him deeper into waters that seemed impossible to navigate. "I'm not sure what to make of all this," Seb finally admitted, his voice raw, carrying the weight of his uncertainty. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, vulnerable and unguarded. "The prophecy, it says that a human and a siren will unite to change the fate of our worlds. But I don't know if I can believe in that. I don't know if I can believe in us." His chest tightened as he spoke, the words lingering in the air, filled with the heaviness of everything that remained unspoken. It was more than just doubt, it was fear. Fear that he might be walking into something far beyond his control, something that could destroy them both. But more than that, it was the fear of what might happen if he allowed himself to truly believe in the bond they were forging. Alaric didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his bare feet making no sound on the rocky ground beneath him. It was as though he was part of the ocean itself, his movements fluid and graceful, a creature born of the sea. Seb's heart skipped a beat as Alaric drew nearer, the distance between them shrinking until it felt like there was no space left at all. The air around them seemed to thrum with an energy that Seb couldn't quite name, something electric, something that pulled them closer together even as the weight of their situation threatened to tear them apart. Alaric's expression softened, his usual guarded demeanor slipping for just a moment. The lines of his face, often sharp with authority, softened in the light of the setting sun, and his sea-green eyes, so full of depth and ancient wisdom, flickered with something Seb had never seen before: vulnerability. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that fleeting moment Seb felt a pang in his chest. Alaric wasn't just the stoic leader of his people, the mysterious siren who seemed to be caught between duty and desire. In that moment, he was just a man, someone who carried the weight of his people's expectations, someone who might be as uncertain and afraid as Seb felt. Seb's breath caught as he met Alaric's gaze, the depth of emotion in those eyes threatening to swallow him whole. It was as if the siren had heard his unspoken fears, understood the turmoil within him. The bond between them, fragile and new, seemed to pulse with a quiet intensity. Seb wasn't sure what this was, whether it was the beginning of something profound or the downfall of everything they were trying to build. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, caught in the same storm, facing the same uncertain future. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their shared vulnerability. Seb felt as though he was standing on the edge of something much larger than either of them could comprehend, something that would define the course of their lives forever. His heart pounded in his chest, and yet, despite the fear and the uncertainty, there was a part of him that felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, whether they succeeded or failed, he knew that he couldn't walk away from this. Not now, not after everything that had happened. And if there was a chance, even a small one, that they could change the future of both their worlds, then he would face it with Alaric by his side. The question now was whether they could both find the courage to take that first step together. Alaric finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, as though he, too, was processing the weight of everything that had passed between them. "I don't know what the future holds, Seb," he said, his words carrying a sincerity that Seb had never heard before. "But I know that whatever it is, we will face it together. I don't expect you to believe in the prophecy, not yet. But I believe in us. And I believe that we can find a way to make this work, if we both try." The sincerity in Alaric's voice reached Seb's heart, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you believe in the sea, Seb?" Alaric's voice was barely a whisper, barely louder than the soft murmur of the waves crashing against the rocks below. The question seemed to hang in the air, drifting between them like a secret only the sea itself could understand. "Do you believe in its power, in its currents and its depths? In the way it can change everything it touches, even when it seems impossible?" His eyes, so full of ancient knowledge and emotion, locked onto Seb's with a quiet intensity, waiting for a response that Seb wasn't sure he had the courage to give. Seb swallowed hard, the weight of the question sinking deep into his chest. His heart began to race, as if the question itself had stirred something inside him, something deep, something buried beneath the layers of his life as a pirate. He nodded, though the motion felt slow, deliberate, as though he were trying to push the weight of his thoughts through his throat. The sea had always been a force greater than anything he could truly understand. It was a force that could destroy, that could rage and tear apart everything in its path. Yet it was also a force that could create, that could give life to new beginnings. The sea had given him his life, his crew, his freedom. It had been both a sanctuary and his greatest challenge. But now, as he stared into Alaric's eyes, something was changing. The sea wasn't just the thing that had shaped his past. It was the thing that would shape his future. And Alaric, standing before him like an embodiment of that same power, was no longer just a part of it. He was the sea, in a way that Seb couldn't yet fully grasp. Alaric's words hung in the air for a long moment, lingering like the ebb and flow of the tide. "Then maybe you don't need to understand everything right now," he said, his voice steady despite the unspoken uncertainty that seemed to hang over them both. The siren didn't seem rattled, but Seb could sense the depth of his own thoughts behind his words. "The sea doesn't always reveal its secrets at once. It lets you feel its pull, lets you get lost in its currents, before showing you the shore. Maybe that's what this is, the beginning of something you can't yet see, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Alaric's eyes softened as he spoke, and Seb felt something shift in the space between them. It was as if Alaric wasn't just talking about the sea anymore. He was talking about their bond, their connection, and the fate that seemed to be drawing them closer, even as it pushed them both into uncharted waters. Seb's breath caught in his throat as Alaric's words settled into his heart, sinking deeper than he had expected. The truth in them resonated, stirring something in him that was both terrifying and profound. He had spent so much of his life fighting the tide, struggling against the currents that had pulled him toward one danger after another. And yet, here he was, standing at the edge of something that felt just as wild, just as uncontrollable. But there was a raw, undeniable truth to Alaric's words. Everything about this situation, about the prophecy, about their bond, had been strange from the very beginning. It was unpredictable and impossible in so many ways. But somehow, it was real. It was real in a way that nothing else in Seb's life had been. And perhaps, for once, that was enough. Perhaps, just for once, he could stop fighting the current and let it pull him forward. For a moment, Seb didn't speak. He let the quiet stretch between them, the waves crashing rhythmically below them as the sky began to darken with the approach of night. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. He had spent so much of his life trying to control his destiny, trying to steer his ship in the direction he wanted to go, no matter what obstacles lay in his path. But now, Alaric was asking him to trust something bigger, something he couldn't control. The sea. The future. And a bond that neither of them fully understood, but that was already beginning to shape their lives in ways they couldn't predict. "You're asking me to trust the sea," Seb said softly, his voice quieter than before, as if the weight of the words had made them harder to say. His mind was still racing, his heart still pounding in his chest, but there was a shift in him now, a flicker of something he hadn't expected. "But what if I'm not strong enough to do that? What if I fail?" His voice faltered slightly, the vulnerability creeping in despite his best efforts to keep it buried. The fear was there, thick and suffocating, threatening to drag him under. "What if this prophecy, this bond, is a mistake?" Seb's words felt heavy, like they carried the weight of every doubt he had ever felt about himself, about his future, about the dangerous path he was walking. What if they were wrong? What if, in trusting the sea, he was simply setting himself up for another disaster? Alaric stepped closer, his presence grounding, as if the very air around them shifted when he did. There was no fear in Alaric's expression, only an unwavering certainty. He reached out, placing a hand gently on Seb's shoulder, the touch light but firm. "You don't have to be strong enough to do this alone," Alaric said, his voice low, filled with a quiet strength that Seb couldn't ignore. "We'll do this together. The sea may not reveal all its secrets right away, but it will guide us, Seb. It will carry us, if we're willing to let it. And you don't have to believe in everything right now. You don't have to know how it ends. But you do have to trust that the journey is worth it." His words were calm, measured, but Seb could feel the weight of them, the same weight he had felt when Alaric had saved his life, when the siren had become more than just an ally, more than just a mysterious figure from another world. Seb met Alaric's gaze, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, still tugging at his insides, but there was something else, something stronger. It was hope. A flicker of trust, of belief in the bond they were forging. Seb didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know how this would end. But in Alaric's eyes he saw something that made him want to believe. Something that made him want to trust, not just in the sea, but in the journey ahead, in the bond they shared. Maybe he wasn't strong enough to do this alone. But with Alaric by his side, maybe, just maybe, they could weather whatever storm was coming. Alaric stepped closer, the distance between them closing with each heartbeat. His hand hovered near Seb's shoulder, not quite touching, as if waiting for Seb to decide whether or not to welcome the comfort. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. "You don't have to do it alone," Alaric said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of Seb's thoughts. "I'm here, Seb. I'm not asking you to carry the weight of this alone. We'll figure this out together." There was no pressure in his words, no urgency, just a steady reassurance that made Seb feel, for a fleeting moment, like maybe he wasn't completely alone in this chaotic world. A quiet silence followed, one that seemed to stretch forever. The sound of the ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks below, filled the space between them, a rhythmic lullaby that drowned out the conflict within Seb's mind. His heart beat erratically, as if it too were caught between the two worlds he was trying to reconcile. His loyalty to the crew he had lost weighed heavily on him, carved deep into the very core of who he was. They had been his brothers in arms, his family, and their absence left an aching void he couldn't ignore. But now, there was guilt too, guilt over the feelings growing stronger with each passing day, feelings for Alaric that he hadn't asked for, that he hadn't expected. He was torn between the past and the present, between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Fear also gripped him, sharp and insistent, as it always did when the future felt too uncertain. The prophecy, the bond with Alaric, the path that lay ahead, it was all so new, so alien to him. He had never been one to trust fate or destiny. Pirates didn't survive long by relying on anything as intangible as the currents of fate. They made their own way, carved their path with blood and steel. But now, with the weight of the prophecy pressing down on him, Seb couldn't shake the feeling that fate was pulling him in a direction he couldn't avoid, no matter how hard he tried. Despite all the turmoil swirling inside him, something in the air between them shifted. Alaric was still standing beside him, a silent presence that Seb had come to rely on in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was no judgment in the siren's eyes, no impatience, just an unwavering steadiness. And in that moment Seb realized something important. For the first time since the wreck, since the loss of his crew, he wasn't drowning. The weight of his grief and guilt was still there, but it no longer felt as suffocating. The turbulent sea within him had calmed, even if just for a moment. And in that calm, he found something that had been missing for so long: hope. Seb's mind wasn't made up, and the future was still uncertain, but the presence of Alaric beside him, steady and unyielding, gave him a strange sense of clarity. It was as if, for the first time, he could breathe again. The future still loomed large, and the path ahead was treacherous and unclear, but Seb realized that he didn't have to face it alone. Alaric wasn't just an ally in this battle between their worlds. He was someone Seb could rely on, someone who would stand with him no matter the storm that raged ahead. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to carry him forward. Alaric's gaze softened as he watched Seb, his eyes full of quiet understanding. There was no need for more words between them. The unspoken promise in the air was enough. A slight, almost imperceptible smile curved the corners of Alaric's lips, a smile that spoke volumes without needing to say another word. It was a smile of reassurance, of solidarity, and of something deeper, something that Seb hadn't been ready to acknowledge, but that he now felt without a doubt. They were in this together, for better or worse. The currents of fate, however unpredictable, had pulled them to this point, and now there was no turning back. Seb could feel the weight of his dilemma, the turmoil of his heart, but somehow, with Alaric standing beside him, it didn't feel quite so crushing. The doubts, the fears, the guilt, they hadn't disappeared, but they had lessened in the face of this quiet, unwavering presence beside him. Seb had always thought that he had to carry everything on his own, that he had to be the one to steer his ship through every storm. But now, he realized, perhaps that wasn't true. Perhaps there was strength in leaning on someone else, in allowing himself to be vulnerable, in trusting the bond that was beginning to form between him and Alaric. The waves crashed beneath them, as if echoing the heartbeat of the world around them. The sea was both a source of life and destruction, a force that could be both beautiful and terrifying. But in that moment, Seb didn't feel the overwhelming fear he had once associated with the ocean. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that, no matter what happened, he wasn't alone. The sea had always been a force of change, one that had shaped his life in ways he couldn't have predicted. But now, the sea was offering him something else, something far more important than survival. It was offering him the chance to move forward, to let go of the past, and to face the future with someone by his side. Seb turned to look at Alaric, and for the first time, he saw not just a partner in this mission, but a companion in the truest sense of the word. They were on the same side now, bound together by more than just fate or prophecy. They were bound by something deeper, something that neither of them could deny. The currents of fate were pulling them forward, and together, they would face whatever came next. For Seb, that was all that mattered. No matter how uncertain the future seemed, as long as Alaric was with him, he could face it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean, Seb finally allowed himself to relax. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of his heart lightened. He still had questions, still had fears, but in the quiet presence of Alaric, in the pull of the sea, he found the strength to believe. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 16: A Dangerous Connection. The sun had dipped beneath the horizon, casting the sky in a fiery hue of red and orange, each color more intense than the last, as if the heavens themselves were aflame. The sea below mirrored the sky's tumultuous colors, its surface shimmering with 1,000 hidden secrets, each ripple a mystery, a reflection of the deep. The once gentle waves, which had lapped lazily against the shore just hours before, now churned with an unfamiliar restlessness. The rhythm of the ocean had shifted, as though the very waters could sense the storm brewing within Seb's heart. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, palpable and thick, wrapping around them like a heavy fog, and it wasn't just the ocean that had changed. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Seb stood at the edge of the water, his boots sinking into the soft sand with each step he took. He stared out into the vast expanse of the sea, the horizon stretching endlessly before him, a dark line where the sky met the water, both seemingly infinite and unreachable. But the beauty of the scene felt distant, disconnected from the storm raging inside him. There was a gnawing unease, a sensation that something was shifting, something he couldn't control. His thoughts swirled in a vortex, each one more chaotic than the last. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow of his being. The connection he had with Alaric was no longer a fleeting bond. It had solidified, become something real, something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The air around Seb seemed charged, as if the very elements had conspired to echo the turmoil within him. The sea, the sky, the earth beneath his feet, all felt alive with anticipation. Seb's heart beat faster with every passing second, a thudding rhythm that matched the pulsing energy surrounding him. It was as though he could feel the weight of the ocean pressing against him, as if the waves themselves were calling him to face the truth of what was happening. He couldn't ignore it any longer. This was no longer just about a prophecy, a fleeting moment in time. This was something real. This was something that would change everything. Behind him, Alaric stood silent, his tall figure bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The siren's presence was a quiet one, yet undeniable. His gaze was fixed on Seb, his sea-green eyes reflecting the faintest hint of the setting sun's glow, yet his expression remained calm, unreadable. He stood with the stillness of the ocean itself, as if nothing could disturb the peace that seemed to radiate from him. Seb felt the pull of those eyes, the invisible thread between them tightening with every passing moment. It was as if Alaric was waiting for Seb to come to terms with the truth of what was unfolding between them. But unlike Seb, whose mind was racing with confusion and fear, Alaric seemed at peace with the bond that had been growing stronger between them. Seb swallowed hard, his throat tight as he turned to face him, his heart hammering in his chest. The words felt heavy on his tongue, but he had to say them, had to make sense of what he was feeling. "Alaric, something's happening. Can you feel it?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tumult of emotions swirling inside him. The weight of the question hung in the air between them, a question he already knew the answer to. But he needed to hear it, needed confirmation that he wasn't imagining this connection, this shift in the very fabric of the world around them. Alaric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drift across the water, as if searching for something, perhaps an answer, or perhaps simply the calm before the storm. Seb watched him, feeling an odd sense of reverence mixed with frustration. Why couldn't he just come out and say what Seb needed to hear? But then, Alaric turned his gaze back to Seb, and in that moment, Seb saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, of ancient knowledge, that made his heart skip a beat. Alaric's expression remained calm, but beneath the surface, there was a depth of emotion Seb couldn't quite grasp, something old and powerful, as if Alaric had known this moment was coming long before it had arrived. "I can feel it," Alaric finally replied, his voice low and steady, yet carrying the weight of unspoken truths. His words were deliberate, measured, and for a brief moment, Seb wondered just how much Alaric truly understood about what was happening. "The bond between us is growing stronger," he continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And it's starting to affect the world around us." The implications of those words settled like stones in Seb's stomach, heavy and undeniable. The bond they shared wasn't just a personal connection. It was a force that had the power to ripple outward, to alter everything in its path. Seb's mind raced, the realization sinking in like a cold wave crashing over him. The sea, the sky, the earth, they weren't just passive observers. They were reacting to them, to the bond they had formed. It was no longer something Seb could ignore or control. This was bigger than both of them, bigger than any of the choices they had made. Seb felt a knot form in his chest, a tightening sensation that threatened to choke him. He had known that this was dangerous, that the prophecy wasn't just some story or myth, but to hear Alaric speak the truth aloud made it all the more real. The world around them was changing, shifting, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The question now was what that change would mean for them, and for the world they had sworn to protect. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of their shared understanding. Seb stood frozen, his mind reeling from the enormity of what Alaric had just revealed. He had always known the bond between them was powerful, but he hadn't understood the full extent of it until now. The world was responding to them, to this connection they couldn't escape, and the consequences of that were far beyond anything Seb had ever anticipated. What did it mean for the future? What would happen when the bond fully took hold, when the ocean's currents began to twist and pull in ways they couldn't predict? Seb didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, but one thing was clear: he wasn't alone in this. Whatever happened next, Alaric would be by his side. And somehow, despite the fear, that brought him a strange sense of comfort. Seb frowned, stepping closer to Alaric, the space between them feeling tighter than it had ever been before. The air seemed to hum, charged with an energy that neither of them could fully understand, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, felt like it carried a weight, a consequence that was beyond their control. Seb's heart raced. but there was no denying the pull between them, the way it wrapped around his chest like a taut rope. "What does that mean? What's happening to the sea?" His voice was strained, a mix of fear and curiosity creeping into his words. He needed answers, needed to understand what he was up against. Alaric's eyes darkened, the usual calm expression he wore shifting into something far more intense, more vulnerable. The siren's gaze seemed to look right through Seb, as though he could see not just him, but the depths of the ocean itself. His lips parted, but before he spoke, there was a flicker of something painful in his expression, like a memory of a truth too heavy to bear. "The sea is sensitive, Seb," he said, his voice low and full of weight. "It reacts to the energies that flow through it, especially those of its own kind." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "And now that our connection is deepening, it's influencing the tides, the currents, the very weather itself. We're connected, yes, but it's more than that. Our bond is becoming a force of nature." Seb's breath caught in his throat, the full meaning of Alaric's words crashing into him like a tidal wave. His mind raced to keep up, but the realization hit him like an anchor dragging him under. He could feel it now, the growing intensity of the world around him, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The winds, once soft and predictable, were now picking up speed, whipping through the trees with a violence that made the branches sway and creak. The leaves were caught in the gusts, dancing and spinning in wild patterns, as if caught in the grip of some unseen hand. Seb's stomach tightened as he turned his gaze to the sea, the waves that had once been calm and inviting now crashing violently against the shore, sending up sprays of water that hit the cliffs with a force that seemed almost unholy. The sky, which had been a vibrant tapestry of reds and oranges just moments ago, had darkened into an ominous mass of swirling clouds, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for a storm. "This isn't just the sea," Seb murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the truth too real. His eyes widened as he glanced back at Alaric, the weight of the moment settling over him like a shroud. "It's us. Our bond is changing the world. The weather, the tides, it's all connected." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were undeniable. Every gust of wind, every crash of a wave, every shift in the sky felt like an extension of their connection. It was more than just an emotional bond. It was a literal force, one that was shaping the world around them. Alaric's expression was grim as he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Seb's. There was no comfort in his gaze, only the hard reality of what they were facing. "Yes," he said softly, his voice steady but carrying a depth of experience that made Seb's heart tighten. "Our hearts, our souls, are intertwined. And with each passing day, the connection between us grows stronger, until we can no longer separate ourselves from the ocean and the forces it commands." His voice dropped lower, the gravity of his words pressing down on Seb with a weight that felt suffocating. "We won't just be two individuals anymore. We will be part of something far greater, something that controls the ebb and flow of everything around us." Alaric's gaze grew distant, as if seeing something Seb couldn't, a future unfolding in front of him that only the siren understood fully. Seb could feel the enormity of what Alaric was saying. The sea had always been an enigma to him, something wild and untamable, but he had never imagined that it could become something so intimately tied to him. The currents, the tides, the storms, they were no longer just part of nature, they were now a reflection of him, of them. And with that realization came the terrifying understanding that they were bound to something far more powerful than they had ever anticipated. "So we're becoming part of the ocean," Seb whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "But what if we can't control it? What if we can't handle it?" Alaric's gaze softened, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them, a calm in the midst of the storm. "That's why we have to be careful," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "If we're not careful, if we don't understand what's happening, we risk unraveling the balance of everything around us." He paused, his eyes searching Seb's as if looking for some sign of understanding. "The sea doesn't forgive mistakes. If we let this bond spiral out of control, if we lose ourselves in it, the consequences will be far-reaching. Not just for us, but for everyone." Seb's mind raced, his thoughts scattering in 1,000 different directions. The weight of what Alaric was saying felt like an anchor pulling him under, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the pull between them. He had never believed in fate, never believed in prophecy or destiny, but now, it was all becoming too real. The ocean, the storms, the tides, they were all part of this bond they shared, and it was clear that this connection was something neither of them could avoid. But the question loomed, heavy and terrifying: could they control it? Could they harness the power of the sea, or would they be swept away by it? The waves continued to crash against the shore, their fury relentless, as if echoing the turmoil inside Seb's heart. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The world was changing, shifting beneath his feet, and he was standing at the heart of it all. With Alaric by his side, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of resolve, even if fear still gripped his chest. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. Together, they would have to face whatever the sea, and their bond, had in store for them. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to give him the strength he needed to survive whatever storm was coming. The air seemed to grow even heavier, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. It felt as if the very sea itself was holding its breath, a deep, collective pause hanging in the atmosphere. Seb could feel it in his bones, the gravity of Alaric's words pressing down on him like the weight of the ocean's depths. The bond between them, this strange, powerful connection, wasn't something transient, a passing moment of fate or chance. No, it was far more dangerous. It was something that could change the very fabric of the world, rewriting the rules that had governed both their lives for so long. And in that moment, Seb realized that he was no longer simply a survivor of the wreckage. He was part of something far larger, something far more formidable, something beyond his wildest imaginings. "What are we supposed to do about this?" Seb asked, his voice strained with the urgency of the situation. His words hung in the air, a desperate cry for clarity in the face of the unknown. His heart thudded in his chest, and his breath felt shallow as he tried to grasp the enormity of what Alaric had just revealed. This was no longer a simple connection, no mere accident. This was a force, a power, capable of shifting the balance of nature itself. "We can't just ignore it, can we?" The question lingered, carrying with it the weight of the uncertainty that consumed him. The world around them felt charged, as if waiting for something to happen, and Seb had the sinking feeling that whatever came next would be beyond their control. Alaric's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, closing the distance between them until there was barely the width of a breath separating them. His eyes, though intense, held a tenderness that Seb hadn't seen before, a quiet understanding in their depths that spoke volumes. For a fleeting moment, the storm around them seemed to calm, the wind stilling, the sea's restless churning easing just enough for Seb to hear the beating of his own heart. "We have to learn how to control it," Alaric said softly, his voice steady, though it held a gravity that settled deep within Seb's chest. "To understand it." He paused, looking out over the sea as if searching for the words to make sense of the enormity of what they were facing. "The ocean is unpredictable, wild, but if we can harness the power of our connection, we can use it for something greater. We can change the fate of both our worlds." The hope in Alaric's voice sent a shiver down Seb's spine. For a moment, he imagined the possibility, the two of them, wielding the power of the sea together, changing the course of history. It was a heady thought, a thrilling prospect. But even as the idea took root in his mind, a deep unease gnawed at him. Alaric's words had been clear. There was a cost. A dangerous cost. But we have to be careful, Alaric continued, his voice dropping lower, his eyes narrowing with the weight of unspoken warnings. If we're not careful, if we don't learn to control it, the consequences could be catastrophic. The gravity of those words hit Seb like a crashing wave, drowning out everything else. What they were dealing with wasn't just powerful. It was volatile, potentially deadly. Seb swallowed hard, his pulse quickening as the full weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. He had always been the captain of his ship, the one who made the hard decisions, the one who steered his crew through the fiercest of storms. But this was different. This wasn't something that could be navigated with experience or skill. This was beyond his control, beyond anything he had ever faced. It was an elemental force, a bond that seemed to tie him to the very soul of the ocean, something that neither of them fully understood. The fear that clawed at him felt primal, deep in his chest, but there was something else too, a strange, exhilarating pulse of possibility. The thought of shaping the future, of wielding this power, stirred something in him that was both terrifying and enticing. The future was wide open, and he was standing on the edge of it, ready to plunge into the unknown. I don't know if I can do this, Seb confessed, his voice quieter now, laden with a raw honesty that felt like it was drawn from the very core of him. His words hung in the air like a confession, a surrender. His hands clenched at his sides as he tried to steady his thoughts, to make sense of the tumult swirling inside him. I don't know if I can control this, us. The vulnerability in his voice was stark, a crack in the armor he had built around himself for so long. The question echoed in his mind as much as it did in the space between them. Could he control it? Could they both wield this power, this connection, without it consuming them? Alaric studied him for a moment, his eyes softening, the intensity of his gaze not diminishing but deepening in a way that spoke of understanding, of shared fear. He reached out, just enough for his hand to hover near Seb's arm, a comforting presence that seemed to ground them both in the storm of their thoughts. You don't have to do this alone, Alaric said quietly, his voice a steady anchor amidst Seb's turmoil. We'll figure it out together. You don't have to carry the weight of this by yourself. There was no judgment in Alaric's words, no expectation of perfection, just a quiet promise, a bond that Seb could feel in the depth of his chest. They were in this together, for better or worse, and Seb had never felt more uncertain of anything in his life. Seb stood in silence for a long moment, processing Alaric's words, the storm within him threatening to overwhelm him as he fought to make sense of the chaos inside. He had been alone for so long, had carried the weight of command and responsibility on his shoulders without help, without anyone to rely on. This bond, this connection with Alaric, was new, uncharted territory, and he didn't know how to navigate it. The thought of sharing this burden, of learning to control it together, should have been comforting, but instead, it left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way that was foreign to him. How could he trust himself, trust Alaric, when they didn't even fully understand what they were dealing with? The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filled the silence between them, the rhythm of the ocean echoing the turmoil inside Seb's mind. The world around them was changing, shifting, and it was as if time itself was bending under the weight of their connection. Seb's heart pounded in his chest, but there was a strange clarity amidst the chaos. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he could truly control this bond with Alaric, or the power it was unlocking, but for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. Alaric was there, standing by his side, and maybe that was enough. For now, It was enough to have someone with him in the storm, someone to help him navigate the impossible. Together, they would have to find a way to control the tides of fate and the forces that had been set into motion. Together, they would face whatever came next. Alaric reached out, his hand hovering just inches from Seb's chest, and the space between them seemed to pulse with an unspoken energy. The warmth of his touch, though not yet physical, radiated through the air like a magnetic pull. Seb could feel it deep within, a surge of heat that ran through his veins, connecting them in a way that went beyond the words being spoken. "You don't have to do it alone," Alaric said softly, his voice a low, soothing hum that seemed to cut through the growing storm. "I'm with you, Seb. We'll figure this out together. I'll teach you, and together we'll find a way to balance the forces we've set in motion." His words weren't just a promise, they were a lifeline, offered in the face of uncertainty and fear. For a long moment they stood there, surrounded by the tumultuous energy of the storm, the waves crashing relentlessly against the jagged rocks below. Seb could feel the storm's fury echo in his chest, as if the very air itself was alive with energy. But what truly struck him was the presence of Alaric, how it seemed to fill the space between them, not as a physical touch, but as a shared force. It wasn't just the siren standing next to him anymore. It was a connection, a bond that was so much more than either of them had ever anticipated. The sensation of Alaric's presence under his skin was overwhelming, a constant reminder that they were no longer strangers or just two individuals tossed together by fate. No, they were something greater now. Their connection wasn't merely a bond, it was a force of nature, something that had the power to shape the very world around them. The sound of the crashing waves filled the space between them, the raw power of the sea mirroring the rising tide of emotions within Seb's heart. The storm raged on around them, the wind howling as if in response to the chaos inside him. The air crackled with an almost electric energy, a strange tension that made the hairs on his skin stand on end. And in that moment Seb felt something deep stir inside him, something he had been avoiding, something he hadn't been ready to face until now. There was no denying it anymore. The world around them was shifting. And with it, everything he had known was on the brink of change. The sea, the storm, the bond between him and Alaric, it was all connected. And there was no turning back. The winds picked up, swirling around them with a fury that matched the intensity of Seb's growing inner turmoil. It was as if the storm itself had become an extension of his own emotions, a reflection of the power that was awakening within him. He had always known the sea to be unpredictable, wild, and merciless, but now, as he stood at the precipice of this new reality, he could feel it in his very bones. The storm was a manifestation of everything that was unfolding around them, chaotic, overwhelming, and yet filled with a strange sense of purpose. Seb's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what they were about to face. This wasn't just a moment of uncertainty. This was the beginning of something immense, something that could either destroy them or elevate them to heights they had never imagined. As the storm raged around them, Seb could feel the weight of his own fears, his doubts, and his confusion pressing down on him. The very air seemed to carry the burden of their shared destiny, and Seb's mind spun with the realization that their connection was no longer just about them. It was about the entire world. The prophecy, the bond, the sea, it was all intertwined in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The path they were on was fraught with danger, but it was also filled with the possibility of something extraordinary. The power they held within them was unlike anything he had ever experienced. And as the winds howled louder and the waves crashed higher, Seb knew that the future had already begun to unfold, and there was no going back. With every heartbeat, the sense of inevitability grew stronger, pressing down on Seb like the weight of the storm itself. The forces at play were far beyond his control, and yet, there was a strange exhilaration that surged through him. He was standing at the edge of something monumental, something that could change everything. The future, uncertain as it was, felt closer now, and the only thing that mattered was whether he would face it alone or with Alaric by his side. The siren's presence was a constant reminder that, for all their differences, they were in this together. It wasn't just Seb's journey anymore. It was theirs, and together, they would have to navigate the storm they had set into motion. Seb's mind raced, but as he turned toward Alaric, something inside him solidified. His resolve, shaky at first, began to harden into something stronger. He knew the storm they were facing was more than just a metaphor. It was a reality they would have to face head-on. But as Alaric stood there, unwavering, Seb felt the weight of his promise. They would figure this out together. They would face the storm, the prophecy, and the forces of nature as one. The fear that had plagued him was still there, but now it was tempered with something else, a determination to learn, to grow, and to wield the power of their connection. "Then let's learn together," Seb said, his voice steady now, a newfound resolve running through his words. "Let's figure this out, before it's too late." The urgency in his voice was clear, but there was no hesitation in his heart. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, understanding, and shaping the future. The storm raged on around them, but Seb felt a flicker of hope in the midst of it, a realization that they weren't powerless. Together, they could learn to control the forces they had awakened. And together, they would forge a path forward, no matter what the future held. Alaric's eyes softened at Seb's words, and for the first time, Seb saw not just the weight of responsibility in the siren's gaze, but also a shared understanding, a shared purpose. They were no longer just two beings caught in the current of fate. They were partners, bound by more than just the bond between them. They were connected to something greater, and together, they would face whatever came next. The storm was far from over, but Seb felt a surge of confidence that he hadn't known he was capable of. With Alaric by his side, he knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, stronger, more united than ever before. The winds continued to howl, the sea continuing to rage as if reflecting the tumult within Seb's heart. But now, there was a new certainty in his chest, a steady rhythm that pulsed alongside the storm. They would find their way through this, together. The world had changed in an instant, and Seb wasn't sure what would come next. But one thing was for certain, with Alaric at his side, he wasn't facing it alone. Alaric's smile was soft, but it carried an understanding that seemed to transcend words. There was something deeper in his expression, a quiet certainty that resonated through Seb, anchoring him amidst the chaos. Together, Alaric agreed, his voice steady and calm, offering a promise that was as unwavering as the storm itself. The weight of his words settled between them, a shared understanding that they weren't alone in this, whatever it was. Their connection, though still shrouded in uncertainty, was undeniable, and in that moment, Seb realized that the path forward wasn't one he had to walk alone. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, as equals, as partners. The storm continued to rage around them, but Seb's attention was no longer on the violent winds or the crashing waves. His senses were drawn to something else entirely, the ocean itself. It was a presence that had always been a part of him, but now it felt more pronounced, more insistent, as if the sea was calling to him in a language he was only just beginning to understand. The pull was undeniable, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't just the physical sensation of the ocean crashing against the shore. It was something far more profound, a connection that ran deeper than the currents beneath the surface. The sea and the bond between him and Alaric were becoming inseparable, their fates entwined in ways Seb had never imagined. As Seb stood there, the winds howling around them, he felt the weight of the world pressing in on him, the knowledge that the bond he shared with Alaric was no mere twist of fate. It was something far larger, something that could shift the balance of the world itself. The sea responded to their connection, reacting to the rising intensity between them. The very fabric of nature seemed to be bending under the pressure of their growing bond, the tides shifting and the winds picking up, as if the world was preparing for the inevitable clash that would come. Seb could feel it in his bones. The ocean was changing, and so were they. This pull of the ocean, so powerful and so undeniable, filled Seb with a strange mix of awe and apprehension. The force between him and Alaric was more than just a connection. It was a force of nature, a tide that couldn't be held back. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at him, there was a sense of exhilaration, too. He was no longer just a survivor of a wreckage. He was part of something much larger, a force that could alter the course of both their worlds. The weight of responsibility hung heavy in his chest, but it was tempered by a strange, unshakable confidence that they could navigate whatever lay ahead. Together, they had the strength to face whatever the sea, and their bond, would bring. With each passing moment, Seb could feel the connection between him and Alaric strengthening, the invisible thread that bound them pulling tighter. The storm, the ocean, the promise they had made to each other, it was all converging, leading them towards something neither of them could fully predict. But one thing was certain: they were no longer separate entities, drifting through their own worlds. They were tied together now, their fates interwoven in ways that were impossible to ignore. As the storm raged on, Seb felt the pull of the ocean more strongly than ever, a force that would shape not only their futures but the fate of everything around them. The bond they shared, though still mysterious, was becoming the very thing that would define them both.